So I'm going to start reassembling this bandsaw now that I have the replacement screw. And I have everything pretty much laid out to a point where I'm going to be working from right to left. This is the tensioning handle and the tensioning shaft, the tensioning cam, and all the bolts and screws for that. Once that's installed, then the tensioning slider goes on the inside. The tensioning wheel and spring go through into the top of this, and then the pivot point connects with the tensioning slider, and then the wheel back on the pivot, and we'll get everything tightened up. And then there's the last thing will be a cotter pin that just prevents the bottom of the tensioning spring plate from unscrewing all the way when you're unsetting tension. So I'm going to work through that here shortly. We'll start on this side of the saw, which is where the tensioning handle and the tensioning shaft come through from. And then I'll move the saw so you can see the inside as we reassemble everything. So I'm going to start working from the pieces we're going to be dealing with are this hole, the plate that holds the tensioning shaft in place is already here and tightened down. We're going to put the tensioning shaft through, and the stop bolt, which runs between these two bolt heads, and that is the untension and the tension stop positions, and that's handled with this stop bolt. So we'll be inserting this through here, and there's a washer that goes on the back. That's going to be our first step. So let me get started on this, and then I'll turn the saw around when we start working on the inside. So the first thing I did was completely loosened the belt tracking or the band tracking adjuster to get it out of the way when I assemble everything else on the inside. The next piece is to make sure your stop nut or your stop bolt is in place, and slide this through the opening. And you want this to come between these two, and that's going to give you alignment. And then you'll see when we go to put on the handle, which will be one of the last things we do, when your stop nut bolt hits the top, your handle's up, and when it hits the bottom, you've pulled the handle down to tension your band or your blade. So, but we'll set that aside for next. So there's no attachments outside. This is just slide it through and you're ready to go. So for the rest of this video, we'll be working mostly inside the top of your bandsaw. So remember, these are mechanical parts. They're going to rub together and move together. Keep a towel handy for wiping everything clean. We work in a dusty environment. We're woodworkers, right? So on this cam attachment or cam adjustment, I'm going to turn it so that my stop bolt is at the top. And this would be the untensioned position. And we're going to put the tensioning cam in. The set screw hole is right here. And the top, the untensioned setting, would be this flat on top, and your hole is on the side of your shaft. So do your best to, I'm going to take, before we do that, there's a washer that goes between the cam and the shaft. Just wipe that down real good. Put that big washer in place. I'm going to take my set bolt and put it through, but not all the way. I need to be able to slide over the shaft. And the shaft may push through, so you're going to want to hold it from the back and then get yourself lined up. This can be a little tight, especially if you have big hands, which I do. And just kind of slide her back and forth until you find that threaded hole. Now, I'm having problems doing this, so what I'm going to do since I know where my positioning is, I'm going to take the stop bolt out so I can turn this all the way upward. I know the positioning of where the screw hole is and where the through hole is on the cam itself. So I'll be able to get this back to where it belongs and aligned it properly while I turn it. So I'm going to turn it. Take my cam back off and turn this so that my screw is right at the top. So the threaded hole is right on top of the shaft, and the threaded hole on here is right on top. This will give me a little more room to work in here. And again, push your shaft all the way through. Give it a little back and forth if you need to get it to set. Now I can let gravity do some of the work by dropping that into the hole. And I can reach around from under the bandsaw and turn that shaft until I can find that hole and get the threading started. So there's my hole, and there's the threading. I can feel it threading in clean. There's no resistance, so I know the threading's good. In this case, I don't use Loctite because if this ever shears off, you want to be able to more easily get the stud that's left behind after the shearing out of there. And if you Loctite it, it'll make it much more difficult. You'll end up having to drill it out and re-tap it, and then use a larger screw the next time you put it back together. So go ahead and give that a good tightening. And it doesn't need to be ungodly tight. You just want it tight enough that vibration from using the saw isn't going to let it out. And now you can see this all turns together. The shaft is in the right position. So if I put my set bolt back in place, with the set bolt hitting the top, or the stop bolt hitting the top stop, the flat of my cam is on top, and that's going to be the wheel at the lowest position, untensioned. If I turn it till I hit the bottom stop, now I've got the high point of the cam at the top, and that's going to lift the wheel to tension your blade. So we're in a good spot now. The rest of this assembly is much easier if you're in the untensioned position. So the next piece I'm going to put in is the tensioning lifter. There's a large hole at the top for a shaft that goes all the way through that rides the top of the cam. So we'll place this in there. Take the large shaft, the washer, and the bolt. I'm going to clean this off, get as much dust off it as we can. Find the slider hole in here. There's a slider slot that your shaft will slide through, and there's a single pivot hole on the slider carriage, and then your shaft should come out the other side. On the other side, you've got a washer and an Allen nut. An Allen bolt. I believe it's also an M616, but I would have to look that up to be sure. Gonna need the right size Allen wrench, of course. And in this case, it's a metric 5. And the opposite side is a metric 7, so you can put tension on that and make sure your bolts are tight. But this is a loose shaft that goes through there. The next piece to assemble is your tensioning wheel. And you're just going to take the tensioning wheel nut off the bottom. This is the base plate for the spring. It screws right off the bottom. Like so. Comes through a hole in the top of the bandsaw and a hole in the back of the in the top of the carriage. From there, you'll slide this into place, and with the flat up, hold this in place and just turn the wheel to get your threading started. You're going to want to thread this through enough that you can see the hole through the tensioning bolt, and there's a cotter pin that goes through there. Put the cotter pin in place. Turn it around, pull it the rest of the way through, make sure it's good and seated. I recommend a new cotter pin. Unfortunately, I didn't have one, so I'm using the original cotter pin. And you want to pull that through till the head of the pin hits the bolt. Because you don't want it to interfere with anything when it turns. So squeeze that on through, and once you have it through, open the wings of the cotter pin all the way around the bolt. Just push them down out of the way on both sides. I use a pair of pliers generally and just twist them around it. And that'll keep your nut from allowing you to untension too far. That's the stop for your untensioning point. Next is the hub for the top wheel. There's a pin for the tensioning gauge. That pin always goes to the bottom, and you have a pivot point for the smaller of the two shafts. The smaller of the two shafts is going to start through. You need to go through the pivot point here and through the pivot point on the tensioning mechanism, and the tensioning mechanism goes in the middle. So you'll have to move some things around here, make sure you got a lot of dexterity in your fingers. But once you get it, you can feel behind it that you're going through the holes properly. Get them in the holes and you'll come out the other side. Same setup as before. You've got an Allen bolt M616. With a 5mm Allen for one side and a 7 for the other side. Put your tension in place. You can't tighten this enough to cause it a bind up issue. It should all have some looseness to it and be able to move. Now I'm going to put some initial tension on this just to lift that up a little bit. And you want to be able to feel there's a back plate on here. That back plate needs to be able to sit on your bandsaw alignment that aligns your blade as it turns on the wheel to get it centered on the wheel. That comes through the back. You want to make sure that plate is hitting it. Once you get to that point, go back, check everything, make sure you've given a good tightening to everything that's in here. Take the retaining bolt off the hub, and now you can put your top band wheel back in place. Line it up, and you may have to put a little tap on it. I also have a dead blow hammer with a leather face. The face is leather to keep from damaging anything. I'm going to put it on there and just give this a good tap. And you'll tap it right into place. Once you have that in place, this top wheel is on a set of bearings. So you're going to tighten this center down tightly because the bearings are what's going to give you your free spin. So I'm going to make sure I've got adjustment in this direction with the wheel, which allows you to align that blade in the center of your wheel. You can see it coming out now. So this whole mechanism now is in place and working. You can see we got nice free spin on the wheel. It's not rubbing on anything. The last thing to do here is lift everything up out of the way and you can put this alignment gauge, you kind of have to feel underneath. Give it a little tug forward and get the slot in that gauge on that pin. And now you'll see there's already a little bit of tension on this. So we're going to drop this down so it shows no tension. Still got a nice free spin. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the blade on. I left this blade in place while I worked. I don't recommend that, but I'm already threaded through the throat and the bearing guides. So I'm just going to get it up over the wheel here on top, make sure I've got it on the wheel on the bottom. And we'll put a little bit of tension on this. Now the last thing we need to put in place is the tensioning handle. And the tensioning handle just slides through the hole on the tensioning shaft. And then there's a set screw that screws right through, all the way through the handle to the other side of the shaft. Go ahead and get that on there. And for testing, finger tight on this is fine. You're going to want it a little tighter later so it doesn't vibrate its way out. And now we can see, as we pull down on the tensioning handle, we're putting tension on that top wheel, and we're getting a nice turn on the blade. So I'm going to take some of the tension off of that. So this is a 3/4 inch blade, and there's a lot of tension on that for a 3/4 inch blade already. I know this gauge is not on, so this is all pretty tight right now. I can feel a lot of tension in it, and my blade is starting to come off the front, so I'm going to need to adjust my tracking quite a bit. So essentially the direction I'm going is that we're raising this edge of the wheel and lowering this edge of the wheel by tilting that way to get the blade to track back onto the wheel. And I'm going to go ahead and manually put it back there because it's already moved pretty far forward. Put the tension back on the blade. Now we'll give it a turn and see what we can get out of it. And that feels to be turning. Looks like we're starting to track well. Put the rest of the tension down on that. I'm a little tight there, so I'm going to loosen it just a tad. Let's see how that feels. We seem to be tracking pretty nicely in the center of this wheel up top with good tension on it. I like to make sure I got my tension all the way down. I'm going to lock the tracking in place. We're going to lift the blade guides up a little bit. Let's give a quick check here, see how our blade guides look. And we're not rubbing, we're just touching. I'm going to go ahead and close this up. Move things away from the throat. Plug it in. We'll give it a start, see what kind of sound we're getting here. Always close everything up and lock it up before you turn on your bandsaw. And that's a nice quiet bandsaw. Probably touching on my blade guides a little bit because I haven't readjusted those. Everything looks really good. I can see through the window that my blade is tracking nicely on the top wheel. And I think this bandsaw is ready to go back to work. So now that everything's tightened up, test it, checked, I have my guide bearings set. I'm going to do one final thing, and that's just a test cut. I'm going to finish the resaw cut that I was in the middle of when I had the failure. So let's see how we do. Here we go. I need to set my guides a little bit better. I had a little stray on that cut, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with that cut through white oak. Going to be planing these down for a continuous box, so one side, two sides, three sides, four sides, and have a nice continuous grain box when I'm done with that. So it's nice to have my bandsaw back because it makes things like that possible. Thanks for watching, everybody.